like to welcome everyone to Fostering Safer Workplaces, Addressing Domestic Violence in a Business Setting. We're excited to have an opportunity to be with you all this afternoon and to more or less test the limits of webinar capacity to have the most engaging presentation possible and an opportunity to deliver some good information, but also hear back from you as to what best practices and other experience that you may have had in your neck of the woods to help navigate these issues as well as possible. So we're going to go ahead and move forward and meet our presenters. And I'll go ahead and introduce myself last, or should I introduce myself first since I was just talking? My name is Aaron Polkay. I'm a staff attorney with Futures Without Violence, and I'd love to offer an opportunity for my co-presenters to present themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Karen Jarmak, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sean Gallagher. I'm the Vice President for Corporate Security and Resiliency at Aetna Insurance.
Great. Thanks, Karen and Sean. And we're going to tell you a little bit about our respective programs, and I'd like to take some time to tell you a little bit about Futures Without Violence. It's an organization that's headquartered in San Francisco, and we have offices in Washington and in Washington, D.C. and Boston. And we've been involved confronting gender-based violence for over 30 years in multiple settings, from healthcare settings to courtrooms. And in particular, our team here in Washington works on a program called Workplaces Respond, which is a national resource center on workplace responses to domestic and sexual violence and stalking, as well as harassment, trafficking, and all ways that gender-based violence, whether it occurs at home or at the workplace, impacts our ability to be safe, financially secure, and fulfilled with respect to our workplace responsibilities and taking care of our families. So that's about Futures and Workplaces Respond, and then I'll hand it over to Karen to talk about the Connecticut Coalition.
Great. So the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence has existed for more than 40 years and is very similar to many other state coalitions on domestic violence and/or domestic violence and sexual assault. We work very collectively with, in Connecticut, there are 18 domestic violence organizations who are doing that really important work on the ground serving survivors in various capacities through legal advocacy and medical advocacy and through shelters and transitional housing and all of those things that victims and survivors need to get to their next best place. What we also do at our state coalition is work around law enforcement, medical advocacy, our member organization services, accessibility and diversity, and then also policy work. And so where we are headed more recently over the past year and a half to 2 years is around the development of policy in the workplace for organizations in Connecticut. And we've really relied on the guidance from Futures Without Violence and Workplaces Respond in that regard. And we're making some headway. I know you're going to hear from Sean Gallagher later on in this presentation from Aetna around some work that Aetna's done and that we were able to work with them a little bit on. And then very recently this month, the state of Connecticut, the governor announced the creation of policy for all state agencies around domestic violence as it relates to the workplace for the first time. And he did that through executive order, so we were really pleased. Sean, I don't know if you want to mention anything or say anything about Aetna, but that's it for CCADV.
Thank you, Karen. So with Aetna, like any other Fortune 500 company, or really any company, we have to address workplace violence issues on a fairly daily basis. Had one this morning, and it was a domestic violence case. We started really tracking our numbers in 2018. We really started in 2017, but we have some full numbers in 2018. And about 25% of our cases are the root cause is domestic or intimate partner violence, which is the type 4. So we've partnered with CCADV. It's been a great partnership, and I think we're in the process of developing a fairly robust program here at Aetna. Karen,
Thanks,
I'll go back
Sean.
to you.
And so I'm just going to go over the learning objectives for today's webinar, and we're hopeful that as a result of the webinar, you're all going to be in a better position to identify strategies to prevent and respond to domestic violence impacting the workplace. We know that these are very complex issues, and policy can really make a difference. Policy that speaks to both the victim and also the offender. And so we're going to talk further on that through this webinar and offer some resources to be able to look at policy templates. We're also going to talk about strategies for best practices of responding to incidents after they occur. And that's where the policy comes into play, and also the ongoing training and practice that can occur within an organization and why that's so critical and important. And then finally, what we say often when we do our presentations to employers is they don't have to solve this on their own. There are resources available within local communities, domestic violence organizations, and they can really also be extremely helpful and critical to ensuring safety for their workers.
Great. Thanks, Karen. So we're going to now take an opportunity to hear from you all by using a poll application to pose the question, does your organization or agency have a policy that addresses domestic violence, sexual assault, and or stalking? And the responses are yes, sexual harassment only, yes, domestic violence and sexual harassment, yes, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, yes, domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and harassment, no, and unsure. So we'll give you a few minutes to put in your replies to the question, does your organization or agency have a policy that addresses these experiences? And it seems as if so we'll just give a few more minutes. And the reason why we ask this question is because when organizations, when businesses are looking at how to respond to employees who may be experiencing gender-based violence, either at the workplace or at home, and it has workplace impacts, there's a number of approaches that can be taken. And you know, we have had a lot of experience, I think, in our business experiences dealing with sexual harassment policies and the way that arises under anti-discrimination law and what we generally call at shorthand EEOC law, Equal Opportunity Employment Commission. But we are also hoping that a number of organizations are also looking at other forms of gender-based violence in the more comprehensive sense. And it seems as if the majority or a plurality, but definitely most of those who responded, have a policy that seeks to address the entire range of possible incidents of gender-based violence that might impact the workplace: domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and harassment. And that's good news because the responsive approaches, the principles of trauma-informed care and confidentiality and anti-retaliation that we will get into later, are quite similar regardless of the type of gender-based violence that might be presenting itself in the particular incident. And not only are the responses similar, but the predicate, the root causes of these incidents are quite similar too. And so it seems like a good amount of the people who responded to the poll have policies that contemplate all of the types of incidences that might present themselves. And I think that, and that's good news. So we'll go a little bit further into the spectrum that exists here, and then also ask you to think about how your policy, if it's a policy that covers all of the aspects of the spectrum, how it might adjust to certain types of experiences versus the other, where there's similarities, where are differences. And so here, gender-based violence, we submit, exists on a spectrum, and the spectrum is all rooted in an effort of a perpetrator, an abuser, a harasser, someone who commits violence. There's numbers of terms, all sorts of different types of terms that we could use to refer to the person who's actually undertaking the violence. And the research indicates that all of these or the nature of each type of violence all roots in a desire for that perpetrator to assert power and control over the victim survivor that they've targeted. So and the other reason why we have to look at these matters under the basis of a spectrum is because they all sort of intersect, right? So, for example, sexual harassment, an unwanted comment, an unwanted touching at that point could be both sexual harassment as well as an act of sexual assault. Or in the case of domestic violence, if a perpetrator of domestic violence at one of your employees' homes happens to then choose to check on that employee's affairs at the workplace and put them at fear, put them in a circumstance where they're fearing that they're being watched, that someone is trying to essentially rise to the level of stalking. There certainly is an intersection there where domestic violence could have aspects of stalking as well as aspects of sexual assault. And if employees are socializing and fraternizing among themselves, oftentimes if you're dating someone at work, you could be suffer from the perpetration of both domestic violence at home or domestic violence and sexual assault at work. So that's why we are proponents of policies that not only look at these the nature or look at this spectrum holistically, but also try to find ways to work through each particular situation individually as well. So, for example, in the case of trafficking, there certainly are some unique aspects of that form of gender-based violence that would require its own investigation and a responsive protocol, depending on the type of workplace that might be impacted by that. So that's the spectrum. And we think that a holistic policy can find ways to identify and sort of take the oxygen away from a perpetrator who's attempting to assert power and control, but then at the same time provide the unique and sensitive, responsive trauma-informed protocols that survivors of all these different types of violence need to be able to find safety and also maintain their economic sufficiency. And so this is prevalent, and I don't think that, I'm not sure, we always cite the statistic that 1 in 4 women have reported that they've experienced domestic violence at some point in their life. So that statistic alone suggests that we have a 1 in 4 chance of being of working with someone or being that person ourselves who has had an experience of domestic violence when we are on the job. But in addition to that, there's a significant number of male workers and an even greater number of female workers who have reported having been subjected to intimate partner violence at some point in their lives. Oftentimes, the term domestic violence in the popular convention is limited in some folks' imaginations or minds or experiences to traditional married nuclear family relations, if you will. So intimate partner violence is a term of art that broadens it, and in that broad terminology, we find that the numbers are actually even greater than that 1 in 4 statistic that I cited earlier. And then because of this, nearly half of respondents to a survey by the Corporate Alliance to End Intimate Partner Violence indicated that because they've experienced domestic violence, there was an impact in the workplace. And again, in this particular survey, you still find another confirmation of that alarming 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 number of people who've had these experiences, and then they're also affirming that these experiences have workplace impacts that we'll get into a little bit later. And I'd like to provide Karen an opportunity, if you don't mind, to tell us a little bit more about the prevalence numbers in Connecticut.
Sure. Thanks very much, Aaron. So The reason why we included this slide in this presentation, knowing though that there are many of you who are not from Connecticut who are participating, is to just give you a sampling that is likely very similar in your own state. In Connecticut, we do something called lethality assessment through an evidence-based tool that's taking place with law enforcement within every single law enforcement entity in the state of Connecticut. And so while most importantly it offers the opportunity to assess risk to a victim and link them to a local domestic violence organization, what it also provides us is with some really credible data around what domestic violence is looking like at some really serious times in people's lives. And so the other side to this, why we use this data and an offering of this in our presentation to employers, is to talk through some of the risk factors so that you're aware, but also these are not always as evident to an employer. I think often an employer might view domestic violence as someone coming to work with some physical signs of abuse, when in fact, in the majority of circumstances, it's really the more subliminal pieces of abuse that are most concerning. So on this slide, you'll see that in nearly 80% of the circumstances, jealousy or control is cited as a specific prevalence around domestic violence here in our state. And so what that might mean is you might have an employee where their partner is trying to control them even at work, and that might mean that they want them to continuously check in. So if they're texting a lot, it might look like they're not being a very good employee, but in fact, it might be that partner wanting the continuous check-in. It might be that they want to control who they're working with, what they're wearing to work, when they're coming, when they're going. They might even be someone who insists that they're going to drive them and they're going to pick them up. And so domestic violence can look, very different often, and so we try to make that something that's important for employers to view. But also, if the offender is unemployed, that is cited as a risk factor for the victim. And because of the stress related to that and the desperation that person might be feeling, but therefore from the employee's perspective, the need for their job and their ability to stay employed is hugely important to them. Spying and threats is also another really prevalent characteristic of an offender, and they might be trying to do that while someone is at work, and or someone might work remotely. And their partner might be trying to do all of these things and also watch them from home. So we just like to share this. This is based on Dr. Jacqueline Campbell's lethality assessment screen, but all of these things are not necessarily characteristics that you're going to physically see when someone's coming to work, but they might be behaviors that you view when an employee is having this struggle.
Thanks, Karen. And so to talk a little bit more about the effects on the workplace, when I first started doing this work, it was easy to connect with businesses with respect to the possibility that a perpetrator of domestic violence may seek to enter a workplace and commit an act of violence that affects their intimate partner as well as bystanders, customers, etc. That was a piece of it that many employers understood and were rightly concerned about, and that is a legitimate concern, and I don't want to diminish it at all. Oftentimes when we have our responsive protocols to active shootings or something to that effect, businesses say, well, in the midst of that response protocol, that's where we speak to issues of domestic violence or sexual violence or harassment. And that's a fair approach, but we'll talk a little bit later about how a sort of a separate and refined approach is actually beneficial to make sure that we aren't backing ourselves into a corner of thinking that the only or the biggest way that issues of gender-based violence affect a victim survivor at the workplace is because of the threat of entry by their perpetrator. Well, in fact, If someone's having an experience of gender-based violence at home or at the workplace, if another coworker is harassing them, or if there's a customer who's stalking them, or if there's an intimate partner who's harassing them and beating them at home and keeping them up all night, or creating questions about childcare, etc., that just makes it simply hard to perform at your highest level at work. So a good separate approach to gender-based violence makes sure that if someone's had an experience of gender-based violence, but we don't become aware that there's something going on in their lives until there are signs of impaired job performance, that we actually have an approach that takes that into consideration and provides opportunities for safety planning, as well as other ways to make sure that they can stay on top of their duties in light of what they're experiencing. And for the same reason, it's the same thing when depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and then when someone's having an experience with impaired job performance or being depressed, or even simply having a hard time to get to work because perhaps the perpetrator of the violence, the person who's committing the violence, is hiding car keys or cutting up work clothes or controlling financial accounts or creating legal problems, that some folks, some victim survivors, many victim survivors actually end up losing their jobs or not being able to advance in their jobs. And that has the very, very unfortunate consequence of making it harder for them to have the economic independence necessary to leave a violent situation. And all of this is connected, having to miss work because of sudden changes, or being late to work because of these issues, or being afraid to come to work because the perpetration is happening at work. All of these impacts all have not only job performance consequences, but very serious economic sustainability consequences as well. And then there's effect on the workplace writ large. If the perpetrator, the harasser, the intimate partner, the person who's committing the violence keeps showing up at work, that's distracting not only for their intended victim survivor, but also for all workers there, because this person is now asserting their power and control over the workplace generally. Oftentimes, coworkers are not trained or aware of or have had the exposure to know exactly how to manage those circumstances. A way that manifests itself is office gossip or violations of confidentiality, because one becomes aware that their coworker is having an experience with an intimate partner or an experience of harassment with someone who works with them. And then another gateway to disciplinary action is if there's abuse of phone or email, or if there's perceived abuse of phone or email privileges, so that the survivor can maintain their own safety by remaining in touch with the perpetrator, then that would have its own issue as well. And then obviously then I began by addressing direct threats or intimidation when someone actually enters the workplace and either confronts a coworker or a superior about their intentions and the threats that they might be bringing to bear. And I understand that Karen probably has a couple of examples too.
Sure. So, and I'm sure in every state there's various examples, and Sean, I don't know if you have one as well to add, but in Connecticut back in 2014, there was a young woman named Lori Jackson who was an analyst for the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And her husband, Scott, was very abusive, and she was trying to end that relationship. And not only did it manifest itself at home, but therefore it also had implications for the workplace, which speak to the effects that Aaron was referencing earlier. And so Scott was calling her employer, calling her supervisor, threatening her supervisor, accusing her supervisor of having an affair with her. She needed time off, and so in terms of time that a worker may need, she took some time off to get a restraining order. When they could not locate him, She needed to take another day off in order to go reapply for that restraining order. She was in a carpool, and so her coworkers were concerned about her safety, and they would drop her right at the door. The security in the first entry level of the building at DEEP had Scott's picture, so that if he ever showed up and said, "I'm just here to see Lori and I'm her husband, no big deal," they would know that, no, that was not safe for him to go upstairs. Unfortunately, he was able to get a firearm out of state, and he did murder her and shot her mother 3 times. Her mother survived. But this is really serious stuff, and so what I try to do is offer some examples, and I can offer another one later on in the discussion.
Great, thank you. And we also want to open it up to you all in the chat box. If you all have any other examples of the effects of gender-based violence in the workplace, I think it would be helpful to learn from each other as the full range that your experiences might be able to inform us. So, you know, we can take this opportunity to do 2 things for our coworkers, our friends who may be having these experiences. And the first is to see the workplace as a safe haven, a place where we can support each other while respecting each other's confidentiality and agency, each other's rights to make our own decisions, and to only for us to only know as much about each other as one is willing to share, but at the same time do everything that we can to create a safe and open space where individuals who might be having experiences of gender-based violence can feel safe to disclose and feel that their privacy will be protected, and that the people that they're talking to are well-trained and well-versed, or at least can get them to the individuals who are as well-trained and as well-versed as possible in navigating the complexities of these issues. And the second point is we want to make sure that when individuals are experiencing gender-based violence, that they can keep their jobs, that they can preserve their economic independence, that the economic limitation question isn't something that's further entrenching them in harmful relationships, because we would hate for it to be that if you couldn't afford the leave, and therefore if the relationship escalates into more harmful spaces, that the economic pressure isn't the thing that prevented someone from seeking the safety that they deserve. And in order to do that, it all begins with the policy that we asked you all about earlier, right? A policy that's accessible to the employees are familiar with, that they can read, that is as free of legalese as possible, that walks them through the framework. What happens if we find out that something might be going on? What are the reasonable accommodations that are available for the purposes of assisting someone through safety planning? What do our investigations look like? What are the things that we can promise or suggest this level of confidentiality versus things where we actually might have to take further action for the greater good and the broader safety, right? We also want to make sure that sexual harassment policies don't live in their own bubble, because sexual harassment is a form of sexual violence, and the impacts of sexual harassment aren't limited to the body of anti-discrimination law that governs most actions pertaining to sexual harassment. So if sexual harassment becomes part of the broader gender-based violence conversation, we're hoping to help workplaces create a culture of prevention. And oftentimes, if you can catch a workplace perpetrator at the harassment stage, then you might be able to interdict them before they continue undetected to the assault and stalking stage. And then obviously, I think if you all have policies, or most of you have policies that cover the spectrum, that you will understand that just because a incident is happening at home, that doesn't mean it's not entirely the workplace's business, that if someone's having an experience at home, as I referenced earlier, that it has workplace impacts ranging from job performance to entering the workplace to commit acts of violence. And then finally, thinking about notions of equity and culture awareness and training so that we can not only create policies that are a responsive or incident response protocol, but are also a prevention protocol, and gets ahead of it as best as possible. So when there's a prevention focus for a business, we sort of are suggesting 4 buckets. The first is training and awareness, right? Taking a look at what happens when you have a new employee. How much time do we spend with that new employee on questions of gender-based violence? How much of a foundation are we laying to make sure that they're educated about the complexities of these experiences as opposed to just being handed a policy or maybe a 30-minute refresher, which a lot of businesses do because there's a lot to cover during onboarding, so we get it. But again, a culture of prevention might require spending a little bit more time on it. Annual refreshers, 2.0s, provide an opportunity for more experienced long-term employees to be able to have access to this training well after they may have onboarded under a different regime. And 2.0s might be issues of equity, issues specific to harassment, issues of the intersections between discrimination and gender-based violence, bystander intervention, questions of workplace civility and confidentiality. There's all sorts of smaller topics that can be part of ongoing refreshers. And then we just believe in awareness raising, to talk about these issues frequently enough so that folks are well versed on them and know what to do if a coworker might be having an experience, but also, you know, in a trauma-informed way so that those awareness raising activities don't find themselves triggering. And again, we can talk a little bit more about these in our resources that we will stand up or suggest to you later. But there's a number of additional refined approaches, evaluations of workplace culture to see if just the way that employees interact with each other actually promotes the possibilities of harassment and violence. A lot of times if you assess it from an employee's perspective of what a workplace climate is like, that they'll actually tell you what they need, whether they've heard about previous responses, what's been swept under the rug, you know, who may have lost a job when we could have done something better to help them earlier. And then finally, we believe that, as Karen said earlier, that there's an abundance of resources in communities nationwide, in particular our coalitions and our local services providers, our employment assistance programs, organizations like Futures, who stand ready to give you the benefit of our expertise so that folks don't feel that they have to respond to an experience that a coworker or a subordinate or someone else in their workplace is having, that actually if you can get them into a safe and confidential space to start with, that there's a number of organizations that stand ready to take them to the next level of safety planning with the principles of trauma-informed care as our guide. So I don't know if Karen had anything else to add with respect to the prevention focus before we move on to some more specific considerations.
Sure. So just, you know, when we're talking through these policies, I think what's really helpful to know is that these not only speak to assistance for a victim, but they also speak to responses for offenders. So in Connecticut, there's a rather large law firm that is a leader that we would view on the issue of domestic violence. We have a board member from that law firm. We have a statewide pro bono partnership with that law firm. And this past spring, one of their senior partners was arrested on a domestic violence charge. And so that really gave us all a moment to pause. And quite honestly, the law firm's initial response, especially the public statement, was lacking. They did revise that statement. But what I would say is that if policies exist, it does also offer an organization, a business organization, something to go to as a best practice or as a standard that when things happen, this is how we respond. When the director of student conduct at Central Connecticut State University was arrested for strangling his wife, the response is rather swift from the president of that college, and that is because they had policy in their workplace, and they had a leave policy when someone is arrested on this type of charge. And they also had a culture where this president was able to talk about why this is an unacceptable behavior, and it really set the standard for the whole organization. So these policies in writing and then coupled with the best practices around the prevention really offers a lot of strong support for an organization when things happen, because we all know that things are likely going to happen. In Connecticut, there is a statute that allows for a victim of domestic violence to be able to take leave, to take that paid or unpaid depending on the circumstance within the organization. But the whole point of this particular slide is to just ask that you all reference in your own state what are those laws that exist around leave policy, around family violence, so that you can incorporate any of those statutes into whatever policies you might be considering adopting, because many of the policies that are offered through the Workplaces Respond don't offer any additional necessarily entitlements, but we want to be cognizant of the fact that there are always going to be laws in various states, and they differ by states. I'm just giving Connecticut's example. And so just to be sure to reference back to those as well when you're developing your policy. And so, Sean, do you want to talk through how Aetna came to make the decision as a big organization to take this on and I think to rather quickly create policy within the organization?
Sure. Thank you, Karen. As I mentioned earlier at the top, that looking at our statistics based on our cases, about 25% of them, almost 25%, were the root cause was domestic violence or intimate partner violence, a type 4 if you're familiar with the OSHA regulations. So the first point I want to make is by capturing those numbers kind of told a story, and it got the attention of a lot of executives here. And it kind of made the process, which sometimes is challenging to put together a brand new policy, but it certainly got that buy-in factor that we're looking for. So talking about the policy, Karen, I'm just curious, are the slides I provided included or?
No, I'm sorry. We just have this one slide.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's fine. So when I talk about the workplace violence policy, the way I view it, it's really the cornerstone of a program, and we really try to put together a fairly comprehensive program. And the three parts of that is really the prevention piece, and I really think the policy sits there. The training piece sits there. The other part is intervention, and the third part is preparedness, being able to react to it. So I'm a security professional, and I'm on that side of it. So the first thing we did when we were trying to put together a policy was to try to identify the key stakeholders that could help us advance the policy. And we're fortunate. We have a very robust corporate crisis management program. We have the various functional areas of the company represented. So it was easy to kind of get that group together, that working group to work on the policy. So it's legal. It's human resources, HR, it's EAP, security, safety and health. That's two different groups here. So by putting all them together and really partnering with CCADV, we were able to put a fairly comprehensive policy together. The next phase of that is the intervention phase, and this is challenging stuff. This is not really easy to resolve. And even when you try your best, and I know one of the examples was an employee that had a protective order, and you provide them a special parking spot, and then you have security escort them in the building, and you make the picture available of the spouse that's threatening the employee. You can do all the right steps, but sometimes it just doesn't work out the way you would like it to work out. So the intervention piece is, and we're not quite there yet, we're almost there, I call it a threat management team, but is to really look at these hard cases and have the members of that working group determine what can we do, how can we resolve this, how can we mitigate this, and that's kind of the next key part. Another thing that we did, taking advantage of CCADV, is my investigators. I have investigative services. They're mostly retired police officers. We went through that LAP training that Karen talked about. And I know all the police officers in the state of Connecticut are required to do it, and we went through it, and we found that to be another great intervention tool when we go through these investigations. So the next part is preparedness, and the other thing I wanted to say is when I talk about workplace violence, it's really a broad spectrum. I think Aaron was pointing that out at the beginning. It can be from a perceived threat to an assault at the workplace up to an active shooter, which is the most severe example of workplace violence. So the third part of this is putting together the emergency action plans for the sites. We just put together an active shooter preparedness plan, and we referenced the workplace violence, that cornerstone in the active shooter preparedness plan. So that's all a key part of it. Another resource I would recommend that you look at, as a business, we follow the American National Standard, which is put out by As Is, and also the Society for Human Resource Management. They work together to put it out. And a couple key pieces of that is that, we emphasize that, everybody needs to work together to provide a safe workplace. It's not just security, it's not just HR, it's really that collaborative approach. We define the scope, what this policy applies to. Another key piece, and this has been mentioned a couple times, is prohibited conduct, what you can't do at the workplace. And the workplace and that's changed a little bit. A lot of times when we say workplace, we think of an office building, but we have a lot of employees that work at home, and we also have a significant population that are community-based employees. That an example of that would be our visiting nurses, and they're required to go into members' homes. They're required to go into hospital settings. So we have a duty of care for them also. So, the workplace is kind of, it's not always that traditional brick and mortar type of workplace that a lot of people talk about. Also, you're not allowed to possess a weapon, not on a Aetna property or a lease property, and also in a own or lease vehicle that Aetna is paying for. So we kind of really spelled it out exactly what's prohibited. Some of that's challenging. State of Texas, they have very liberal weapons laws. So, you really have to look at that as you put your policy together. The next key piece of that is reporting procedures. If you are a victim of it, how do you report it? And we gave them multiple options to report that. And just recently, and Karen's aware of this, we went to the LiveSafe app. If you're not familiar with it, I suggest you just Google it. But it's a way to, everybody uses their phone now. They can reach out to security directly. It can be anonymous if you want to give a tip. So it's just another tool to be able to report something and for us in security to be able to respond that much faster. In the policy, we also talked about if it is an active shooter and the guidance, which is really the Homeland Security guidance, DHS, which is the run, hide, and fight, which I'm pretty sure most people are aware of. And then I think the last piece I want to highlight is what we do as a company to try to mitigate or reduce the risk associated with workplace violence. And an example of that is if you are a protected person, meaning you have a protective order or restraining order, make us aware of it. List the workplace as one of those spaces that's protected. And, if we're aware of it and the spouse who's making the threatening behavior enters the property, it gives us the great probable cause that we need to give the police to be able to do something. So that's one of the risk reduction measures that we suggest. So that's our policy. It's a living document to some degree, but it certainly gives us the horsepower here in security to do the job and to also institute the mitigation policies, actually the procedures that we need to implement. So that's all I have, Karen. Any questions?
No, I think that's great, and thank you. And I know what was really interesting about the experience from what you shared with me at Aetna, it was a real collective approach between security, human resources, legal, in terms of discussing and putting together that policy. So thank you. And I loved also what you were talking about in terms of tools, because we know that survivors and victims of domestic violence need various tools to stay safe. And so I know that's why, and this next slide, the Connect with Connecticut Providers talks through, this is specific to Connecticut, but quite honestly, you can just skip to the next slide, just to, thank you. There are a host of tools available within domestic violence organizations that help keep victims and their families safe, because we know that victims of domestic violence, what they often need and what is often helpful is a safety plan. And a domestic violence advocate that is protected with confidentiality and also has a particular skill set around the really complexities related to domestic violence would have the capacity and also the depth and breadth of support, whether that's legal advocacy. So when Sean was referencing a restraining order application or a protective order, an advocate who's in court helping with that, safety planning, that 24-hour response, because we know these things happen on weekends, on evenings, on overnights, support for children, and just ongoing advocacy in a host of areas, and obviously emergency shelter if that's necessary. So this is what we have in Connecticut, but we know that these types of supports are available within other states as well. For those who are watching from Connecticut, on the next slide is the map. And so, again, I know that if you go to your state's coalition against domestic violence, you will be able to see these same resources available for victims to reach out to for help.
Great, thank you. So we're going to bring it on home. You heard us refer to response protocols. Trauma-informed care was the term of art that we used. And we just want to highlight again that because of the unique nature, the sensitivity, the broad-based impacts of gender-based violence, that the importance of providing the survivor an opportunity for agency over decision-making as much as possible is key. When one is having an experience with gender-based violence, domestic violence in particular, because it's rooted in notions of power and control, the perpetrator is seizing control in just about every other affair of that survivor's life. And in as much as the workplace can be a place of agency and self-determination, that's really the thing that most is the greatest foundation, or the most important foundation of a trauma-informed policy. And again, that's little things like, instead of telling the survivor what you think they should do, and that also operates under the assumption that you are aware of all of the aspects that they might be considering in making these decisions. It's good to train each other, regardless if you're a coworker or a supervisor, to move away from that and towards, letting the person being heard and then trying to connect them to resources that they can avail themselves of, that can walk them through the initial steps of safety planning, and then give them a confidential opportunity to hopefully give the whole picture. And again, another principle of trauma-informed care is oftentimes when these circumstances happen, the inclination is to put the onus on the person who's making the report to suggest or be the subject to actions to allow them to avoid the perpetrator. So like, what can you do, or what can we do to keep you away from the person that is harming you or that you're alleging is harming you? And again, that's extraordinarily isolating and brings a lot of attention and may deter reporting. So bringing them in to the conversation as to phrasing it in the context of what they might need is a much more effective way. And what they might need may be less extensive than the full menu of options, and based on the larger safety protocols, might also end up being doable. So again, it's trauma-informed, it promotes agency, but it also matches the survivor's needs to the realities of the workplace. And we also wanted in this last 10 minutes, if you all have any suggestions as to other positive ways that organizations can work through an incident of violence, if it's domestic violence or gender-based violence more broadly. If you all have had any experience with this issue at your workplace, from all the different ways that it might present itself, just please feel free to use the chat box to inform other participants in the webinar as to other positive ways that an organization can walk through a situation involving gender-based violence. And so, from our experience, there are some best practices that we would suggest to you. Again, I spoke earlier about the pre-written policies and protocols to make sure that folks are aware of what this looks like at your organization well before they're in the moment of crisis. An awareness-raising program is helpful in that regard. Again, confidentiality is key here. The more employees believe that there will be gossip or the spreading of the personal experiences that they might disclose, the less likely they are to disclose because of the isolation and the sensitivities of these particular issues. Again, crafting policies that prioritize safety as opposed to there's a way that policies can be phrased that highlight liability prevention and investigation as opposed to immediate safety needs and safety plannings before you get to the realities of or the necessary realities of investigation and perhaps discipline if the perpetrator is on the workplace. And then the policies can sort of begin to give employees a preview of all of the range of accommodations that might be available from leave. We really love it when organizations have the availability of what's called safe leave. So if you are in a crisis situation and you need to go to a courthouse or a police department to obtain a protective order, or you need a couple of days to get your children and yourself to another place of safety, that would not have a economic consequence, that there's actually paid safe leave for that sort of stuff. So if your organization happens to have that available or might consider having something like that available, that individuals know well in advance. And then finally, the act of regularly checking in with employees throughout the process. Our experience and our discussions with survivors tells us oftentimes once they make the report, it goes into this black hole. It goes into this dark place where there's no transparency, where they're not sure if the investigation is underway or if their report is being taken to heart. Oftentimes, some survivors never hear anything about their report again, while in the other extreme, survivors hear of an action or a decision that's taken without considering or consulting them in advance. And again, people talk and people see how these matters are addressed and resolved in other incidents, and that certainly colors their confidence in the process if they were to have an experience that they would like to report and seek accommodations or seek safety planning with respect to their own personal lives. And we have a pretty good response that's coming in from a DV organization. And so the question is,
So
Yep, go for it.
Around some work that CCATV's been doing to reach out to businesses like McDonald's, Wendy's, or retail stores. What I will say is this project is still in its infancy here, and we've been working, trying to work with unions, trying to work with state agencies, the legislative branch, private organizations. But you raise a really good point. We have not worked with a Wendy's or a McDonald's, for example. I think what becomes harder for us when working with those businesses is they tend to be more national in nature, and so our work really in Connecticut has focused on more Connecticut-oriented businesses, either businesses that are maybe national in scope like Aetna but based in Connecticut. So it might, Aaron, something for us to think further on is how do we reach those companies that are national but have retail shops or restaurants across the country that are then in states.
For sure. Thank you. Yeah, that certainly is something that's on our mind. In particular, the reference to the restaurant industry is near and dear to our hearts because of the disproportionate effects of on-the-job harassment and violence, as well as the economic insecurity that comes with trying to be able to leave a harmful relationship when one is making a lower wage. So thank you for that contribution. And with our last few, go ahead.
I think, Elizabeth, we've been trying to work with, for example, Women's Health Connecticut has a number of OBGYN sites, I think 180 in the state, and we're working with them because they have policy for all of those sites. And so that's been easier to do than try to infiltrate a national organization. But I'd love to try to think through how we do that.
Yep, and unions also are a good vehicle to organize workers who are in many different locations, depending on what region and part of the country you are in. The union provides, we have a lot of great relationships with unions who have been able to start this discussion with various types of workplaces. So in our last couple of minutes here, we just wanted to let you know that at workplacesrespond.org, www.workplacesrespond.org, that we have a number of resources that are available, ranging from safety cards and model policies to actual guides that supervisors can read to begin to familiarize themselves with best practices in response. And so we invite you to visit that site. And we also invite you to please contact us. You can find us through the website, and we also are going to put up a screen that has our contact information. Before we close, I certainly want to address a question that came in regarding implicit bias, and that's what I was referring to in the piece that I did not have an opportunity to get deep into with respect to culture and climate. Implicit bias certainly is a key consideration with respect to prevention. And oftentimes when we've talked about issues of equity and implicit bias, we've talked about it more in the context of promotion, in the context of access to job opportunity in the first place, in the context of civility. And I think that we are doing a better job nationwide of making the connections between how we, whether or not it is explicit or implicit, the ways that we treat each other based on our various identity characteristics can make it really hard to navigate issues of gender-based violence, be it race, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, immigration status. Oftentimes, and I think implicit bias is certainly a challenge even when one is well-meaning and seeking to connect a coworker from resources. They might make certain assumptions one way or another about cultural implications with respect to the survivor's ability to navigate that circumstance and whether or not they need help or whether or not there's actually a problem in the first place. So I'm glad you asked that question, and I would love to spend some time going forward. If you, in particular, visit workplacesrespond.com/harassment, there are some materials there that speak specifically to the cultural implications and the climate implications of that. And within all of that is is the key consideration of implicit bias and other ways that we may purposefully or inadvertently discriminate against each other and how that can make workplaces less safe on these very same issues. So thank you for that question. And we're at 3 o'clock. So I would love for you all to please contact us with any additional questions that you might have. And then please also click on that evaluation link as you exit so we can hear from you as to ways that we can improve this presentation going forward and other topics that you would appreciate us covering using this format, this medium, and others that might be available to us. So thank you for your hour. And on behalf of Karen and Sean, we really appreciate this opportunity to chat with you all today, and we look forward to keeping the conversation going on in the future.